Yeah, so my name is Ibrahim Mahama. I'm an artist from Ghana. I was born in the northern part of Ghana in a town called Tamale, which is the northern region's capital. Yeah, and I grew up in the capital in Accra, and I decided to study art in art school when I was 14, and went to uni in 2006 to study painting and sculpture, and did my master's in the same university after I graduated, and then later on did a PhD, which I'm yet to graduate from. Yes, but I generally come from a big family, and that has gone a long way to influence my practice in a way. But I also spent a lot of my childhood in boarding school. So I was away from my family most of my childhood. And I think that also really helped to shape my thinking because already being in a boarding school came with a certain sense of independence in terms of thinking. And also, yeah, like I wasn't so much in love with this idea of boarding school. So I developed the habit of drawing. I used to draw a lot, make comics and things like that. And I think it eventually affected my path in terms of where my interest fell. Yeah. I think it's a beautiful city from what I've learned, both from the historical perspective and also just from aesthetical points, because they're really interesting old buildings, both from the medieval period and also from like the last 5 centuries. I've seen quite a lot in a very short time. The program has been quite intense, from seeing all these industrial spaces, leather making spaces, the tanks, to yesterday we went to the one of the big textile industrial factories, which was really inspiring to actually see how the systems work and all that. But for me, it's always very important to somehow look at things not just from the perfect point of view, but also in terms of the decay and then also the glitch within the system. Because in some of the factories, you realize that everything had to be perfect. They had to cut, everything had to be seamless and all that. So I was thinking a lot about that in relation to the architecture of the city and how that has been appropriated over the years. People still inhabit these spaces. So for me, yeah, I think it's a genuine city. Yeah, and I think that I wouldn't mind actually living here if I had it if I didn't have so much work to do at home. It wouldn't be bad actually living in a city like this. Yeah, I decay is very important to me. Yeah, in the traditional sense, when something is decaying, for a lot of people, it's an end in itself. But for me, the decay within any system or any form, like whether it's with food or it's with architecture or with materials, it's a beginning of another life form, another life cycle. And that is where the true essence of politics is captured. And also, material conditions are really captured within that sense of decay. So, when a building is decaying, there are all kinds of microbes and things that begin to form within it. At that point, you are able to really you're able to see the true, the true form of the architecture in terms of when it's stripped bare of to its bare essentials. How do you confront yourself with it? So the city is an open canvas actually, and it has all these different forms within it. Someone might be interested in the so-called beautiful aspects of it, but for me, I think that the decay might be the beautiful aspect because within the decay, it's almost like a portal. Once you go through the decay, you can, because the thing is decaying because it has lived. So within the depth of life is somehow buried underneath the decay. So once you go through decay, then you begin to see, oh, this, that. So it's like a time capsule. Decay is like a time capsule for me. Because in Ghana, some of the decisions I've made has been trying to buy up old spaces which are of historical value, but maybe the city or the state might not really think about it at historical value because maybe it's a space that has been abandoned, that is not being used, and maybe you find that there are plants or fungus or things growing within the space. But I thought it was the most interesting because at that point there's so much life that you can uncover within it. Yeah, and it's important for at least for a generation of young people to really understand that culture is not so much about what exists, but also what we create and how we interpret things. So actually, today, interestingly enough, we were having a meeting about maybe what my impressions of the city so far has been. And I was particularly interested in this space. They were like, "Oh, we didn't know that you think about this space because I was meeting you here today." Um, yeah, and we were talking about the fabrication of, let's say, a wooden loom, mechanical one. That's in Ghana because I'm interested in the history of textiles. So I was thinking of fabricating certain special types of looms that we could use to produce new textiles from old materials, things like that. And we would possibly install them within the space and then work with it in such a way that it becomes a structure which becomes part of the architecture and all that. And I was speaking to the guys and saying, "Oh, maybe it's possible that as we create the loom here, we can possibly create one also, or a few in Ghana that can also go back into like industrial processes within the region that I come from and things like that." So that is where also the politics is important to me. That I'm not just interested in creating work as an artist that can be consumed by the Western markets in terms of like audience or whatever. I'm also interested in how the ideas that I give birth to, how that also becomes some kind of a gift also to the local community within the spaces that I, yeah. Well, art is supposed to be generous if you think about it, because artists are always talking about democracy within their work in terms of its dissemination and all that. But when it really comes down to the art market in terms of circulation and all that value systems, then suddenly everyone becomes very rigid about their work and where it can be and where it cannot be. But I think that if you truly believe that art can be democratic, just allow it to be free and allow it to move and allow it to occupy spaces, allow the processes, open up the processes within it so that it can actually live in as many spaces as possible. Because the moment you say you're an artist and you're making work, you also have to realize that your work is going to be heavily inaccessible by a lot of people. So for me, the access is also very important to the practice of politics within the artist process. Of course, the world is full of contradictions, and you have to work with some of these things in order to be able to push your practice forward. But ultimately, the idea is to be able to create at least an equal level playing field. So at least the work, the idea of the ground zero, the spaces that ordinarily would be used as subject matter to produce contemporary art, this time around can be the spaces where their work is consumed. So in the end, they don't really have to become subject matter. So I'm interested in eliminating the the context of the subject matter as something that you use to produce something for the market instead of actually producing events and phenomena that actually allow the subject matter, the quality of life to develop differently in those spaces. There's a lot of markets in Europe, but also I think there's also a lot of markets. A lot of my work is disseminated around the world, but the two galleries I work with, of course, are in Europe, one in Italy and one in London. And for a long time, I felt that there have been more European collectors who collected my work, but also there are a lot of American institutions, North America, South, that also have collected work, and maybe in Asia and others, but predominantly maybe in Europe or something. But for me, that is important. But the other most important, well, so far it hasn't. There hasn't been the case. Maybe in a few times earlier in my practice, I had a few instances where there were people who wanted to mutilate the work or do things that we had issues with. And also sometimes maybe a gallery might say that, oh, there is a collector who wants to buy this and that. Maybe it's we should only offer one because at the end of the day, you also want the work to be disseminated. Or sometimes they say, oh, there's a collector who wants to buy this and that, but he has this history. Are you interested? So there's a possibility. There are some artists who don't care. Their work can sell just to anyone. But also, it depends on the kind of work that you're producing. Because most of the pieces that I produce are very, some of them are large scale, and sometimes also in terms of the materials that I use, you want them to be in a public context. So if there is an institution that can own the work that goes into, let's say, a public collection for possibility of a wider public to experience, why not? So I mostly tend to focus on that. It depends on the work. Some works are designed to be ephemeral from the beginning. You know it will change. But some works are also designed that you know you're making it with ephemeral material, but you want it to stay because maybe it's a piece of drawing. And then eventually you want it to be something that also, because the, the decay within it, at some point it stops. And at that point, you think that it best tells a story of, let's say, life or something like that. So you wouldn't want it to degrade beyond that point. So you try everything possible to somehow freeze it in time. Where there are other works that you produce and you realize that it's going to change, like the jute sacks and the boxes and things like that. You know that in time it's going to change. And sometimes I deliberately also collect materials and I leave them out in the weather in order for them to age and decay over time. So they get to a certain point, you're like, oh, at this point, it is right to work with. But I'm open to anything. In Ghana, I've collected many different things over the years. So it depends. Yeah, I've collected like sewing machines, I've collected cabinets, desks, leather, uh, discarded leather from leather processing, old scales from industrial spaces, airplanes, train parts, models, blueprints, all kinds of things over the last couple of years. So for me, I don't have any. I'm mostly led by ideas. So if I have an idea, I allow the idea to be fluid. So today it could be paper, tomorrow it could be wood, tomorrow it could be gas. It all depends on the aesthetics and also where the history around the material. In 2010, actually, when I was finishing uni, there was an idea to build a studio, but in Tamale, where I was born, but I never had the chance to do it because financially I couldn't. I didn't have the money to do it. And in 2014, when I was finishing my master's, I got the chance to do an exhibition in London, and the work was acquired. So with that money, I decided to lay the foundation for the first institution. So it was a studio space that was meant just to be a place where to make work that could inspire maybe other artists. And eventually, I'd realized that maybe it could be more because what is really an artist studio? Is an artist studio a place where the artist makes objects for the market, or it could be a place where maybe pedagogical forms come together, things like this. So the first studio was converted to like like a contemporary art institution, which I named the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art. So it was dedicated to retrospectives of older artists who had practiced for many years in Ghana, but their works were never shown publicly. So we started doing exhibitions around their works. And with those exhibitions, we focused mainly on workshops with school kids in the region. So through these workshops, we could somehow tap into the artists' works, their ideas, and things like that. So we did that over a long period. Then within that same time, parallel to SCC, I was also building my other studio, Red Clay. And Red Clay became the much bigger space because I was interested in building a parliament of ghost parliament that used decay as a starting point in thinking about futuristic ideas. I built an archive of decayed materials that are collected around the country, photography and all kinds of things. I collected 6 airplanes, which I brought there from the capital, 700 kilometers away, and I converted them into classrooms and pedagogical spaces, teaching children drone tech and other things together with my colleagues at the institution. And also, last year during the pandemic, I made a conscious decision to buy an old grain silo to convert it into a cultural institution. It had been built in the 60s, abandoned, never used. And there was a whole ecosystem of bats living in it. And I decided to collect and then restore it into a cultural institution, but leaving the bats in the space because the bats are very important in terms of thinking about cohabitations of spaces, particularly when it's time of the pandemic and then like ecological crisis. Yeah, so all these and many other things I've been looking at within Ghana and particularly within the region. The region has been important to me because economically and politically, it's been like the poorest region in the history of the country. And for me, it's important that as an artist coming from there with this much international success, it's important to somehow almost bring back everything I have into this space to see what possibilities there are to open up other futures for generations which are yet to emerge. I don't think there will be an end. The end will be me and every other of us will die and leave it, and it will keep growing because there will be people that will take it from there. But I think that aim is somehow to be able to work the institution to a point where it can actually cover a lot of things. So, for instance, I've been keeping a lot of my own work that I produce, some which go for international exhibition, but a lot remain to build like a permanent collection, a gift, some kind of an endowment to the institution. So there are spaces that I still need to build for these collections. Industrial spaces, which I'm thinking about making to somehow go back into the history of textiles, things like that, which is something I still have to do. And recently I was talking about building like a basic school there, which could actually give access to the kids in the community, access to education, and also access to the kind of education that we are passing on through our programs in the studio more permanently, and building a kiln to go into like what's the name, ceramics, brick making, and creating different types of like brick blocks that can be used in building like structures in the future. There's a lot of share nuts in the region. So also going into like share nuts and the potentials that there are in terms of oil and also fuel and all kinds of other things. Um, yeah, and building like currently we have a cinema space which I'm working on, which when completed, it will serve. We can use it to be able to go into the history of filmmaking and also allow for because we don't have any cinemas in the city. And so, and also in Ghana, most of the old cinemas were converted into either shopping malls or churches. So it's very important to go back to these cultural forms. Sound, to create sound studios that can allow us to be able to record sound because our history in these regions have been mostly based on oral histories. So you have people passing on histories, but it's important that we're able to create spaces that ordinarily you could just come in with your kids and then as you tell them a story or whatever, you can archive it and then save it somewhere. Or you have a story regarding if your family or something that you know if there's a space that you can come and you can record it and it goes into a sound cloud. And 1,000 years from now, it can be accessed. So for me, I'm interested in building these things. So the artist studio, which is Red Clay, now almost becomes like a portal at which we can somehow go into the past and also access the future. Historically, um, these kinds of projects haven't been done because it doesn't make sense, because it's not a profitable venture. It's not as if you're building it and tomorrow you make money. You don't make any money from it. But what you do is that you create a chain of value because there are kids who are going to inherit these things and it's going to really change their cultural perspectives and the way that they look at the world. And for me, that is worth any amount of thing. All the questions of climate change and all these other things, if we really need to address it, we really need to invest into local communities, infrastructure, and all that. Because if we leave it just to the people who are living in the urban spaces, we can never achieve this. It's not hard to be that idealistic. I think rather the people who are not thinking in that manner are rather the idealistic people because yeah, how could you not think like this or practice like this? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about the survival of humanity. And how can humanity survive without actually taking culture seriously? So for me, I think it's rather idealistic when you look the other way and say, hey, the world is going to take care of itself. Those people in the rural areas or outside the city center where comes from these spaces. Um,
Just one last question, which is well, it's not exactly the last one, but just for me to know,
okay.
between changes.
Okay. Within currently it depends on the schools, but mostly we have kids from the ages of 5 to 12. And then we also have high school 12 to 15. And then in some cases, senior high schools, so teenagers. But mostly we focus on the very younger ones. So between 5 and 12 and 13, we mostly focus our programs on them. So either spending money on buses that go and bring them to the institution, or we directly go to the institution and we do workshops, and then we also like do all kinds of. And it's not necessarily as an artist, one might think, oh, he goes to drawing, but no, it ranges from different things, from writing to technology workshops to many other things. Everything.
And this is really the last question.
Yes.
At this point, how unhappy are you with the things that you're doing?
I'm very happy actually. I think I get only unhappy when.
I mean, what's your ambition with those kids?
Well, I think that I don't even know if I will live to see any results from it. Maybe in the next yeah, maybe in the next 20, 30 years, we would really see the results of this. And for me, as we were talking about yesterday, is that the moment you occupy this position, you have to realize that you have a certain responsibility, particularly to your community. And freedom, in all of its essence, comes down to responsibility. If we cannot exercise true responsibility in order of, like, let's say, um, doing some kind of a work that transforms another generation, one, um, ideologically, because most of the problems that we have in the world is due to ideological conflicts, ideologically, and two, also in terms of looking at the material world, in terms of what it presents and how we can reinterpret it. Then the future will forever remain what it was in the past, even though we haven't even gotten to it. It's already somehow living in the past. So for me, I think that in as much as we occupy these positions, we have to constantly remind ourselves that we've been given a certain gift which we need to somehow redisseminate to generations and generations to come, so the world, together with any other life form that it possesses, can be much better than what it was.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim.
Thank you.
And as a good Irishman would say, you have a good heart. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you.